Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisrael, or that Rav Yechezkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. This is Jewish history like you've never heard it before. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Ephraim, Zalman, Galinsky, and Gedalia, Guttentag. Rabbi Ephraim, let's begin with a story that may or may not be true. So sometime in the 1930s, or maybe in the 40s, two very powerful personalities got into a car in London. One was the head of Shell, the oil company, a British government minister, a wealthy Jewish aristocrat. This was a man called Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, who was the head then of the United Synagogue, who was used to leading the Rabbonim around by the nose and controlling things. The other powerful personality, and this man looked like a very powerful personality, was Rav Yechezkel Abramsky, known to British posterity as Rav Abramsky. And the story goes that Robert Whaley Cohen got into the car first. He didn't look that the head of the London based in should get in first. He got a tap on the shoulder with a stick, with a rabbinic stick. It was Rav Abramsky. Rav Abramsky said, "Cover the Torah. I get in first." Now that story, Rabbi Ephraim, Zalman, Galinsky, Shlita, may or may not be true.
But that is a perfect story to exemplify who Rav Yechezkel Abramsky was. But you'll have to explain to us, what does the United Synagogue mean? How does British Jewry structured? Because you have to say the truth. An classical American listener will not understand anything about the whole structure. Because there is no structured congregation, Jewish congregation in America. Everything is private.
So this is why the classical American listener is going to have to hold on, and this is going to be the substance of this episode, to understand and unpack the meaning of that story. Because that story is, whether or not it's true, exemplifies who was and defines, to my mind, one of the great Gedalim of the 20th century and what he did. Rabbi Yechezkel Abramsky was a self-made Gadol, right? We're going to see in another episode 2 of this series that he was basically raised himself before coming to yeshivas. He became a Gadol without them. He was a self-made Gadol who went on to become a Talmid of Rav Chaim Brisker.
At later stages in life, not as Yeshiva Bacha.
Not as Yeshiva Bacha. Who went on to stand up, become one of the last leading Rabbonim in Russia, and continued to defy the communists. That after the communist takeover, one of the last great Rabbonim there, who therefore stood up to Stalin, ended up in Siberia, and then was in the 1930s appointed the head of the London Beis Din, which was that time a very, very chashuv seat, 500,000 Jews, and if essentially the head of the Beis Din of the British Empire as it still was then. And this is where I come to the crunch, and this is in terms of the definition who he is and what he's going to be doing. He was such a powerful Torah personality that he was able to stand up in the face of the liberalism that was taking over Britain. The Jewish liberals were talking about the reform that was threatened to engulf British Jewry in the same way as it eventually did in America.
Which is fascinating, that British Jewry is the only Jewry that managed to block the reform from entering the official rabbinate, and that's what you're going to be talking about.
And this is correct, and this is the contention. I'm going to be quoting my father, Rabbi Jonathan Guttentag, who was a senior member of what was then the United Synagogue Rabbinate in England, and it's something that I've absorbed from him, and I want to develop this thesis that it was this very, very strong role played by Rav Abramsky that's standing up in the 30s and 40s and stopping the tide and turning things back and enabling, as it were, this blocking movement on the reform. So if I had to get
Which is a chiddush into itself, that one person managed to change the tide.
You know, it may be overselling it. It may indeed be overselling it. But if I had to give this particular episode a title, I'd say Rav Abramsky, the Gadol who saved an empire. That may be there's too much of a literary flourish there.
We hear that journalist streak out of
Correct.
Coming out
You can't incorrigible. You can't irrepressible. You can't hold. A journalist with a headline is unstoppable. So that is my contention. I'd like to unpack that. As you say, we're going to need to go gently for the rest of the world, for the global audience over here, to understand just what it is, why we getting hot under the collar about a Gadol in England in the 30s and 40s. I think just to take this away, we need a bit of just a very short background who Rav Abramsky was, and we're going to actually be unpacking more of this in the second episode, which is relevant then. But suffice it to say that the Rav Yechezkel was born in a little village, and I think most important thing to know about this village, there wasn't even a minyan there, but again, we're going to get to that. Rav Yechezkel Abramsky was born in 1886, lived to 1976, and he was born in a place near Belarus, which is now Belarus, called Dashkovchi or something like that. Dashkovichi or something like that, but okay, you have to be a native or a local to really pronounce these things. His parents were good people, but they were far from rabbinic stock. He had a shas at home, which was not a usual thing. But, and I think this is the most important thing to know about him, Rabbi Ephraim, he grew up in a village with a shtetl. When you talk about a shtetl, I don't think you can get any more of a shtetl than this, because it didn't have a minyan. It didn't have a minyan, and he stayed there till age 17. By which stage, I don't want to give all the details away, but by which stage he had become enough of a gadol that when he was headhunted, very literally, by the way, by Novadik, when they came to hear of this Eloi, learning on his own in this outlying village, they brought him to Novadik, and he ended up going very rapidly through the yeshivas. Within a year of arriving in yeshiva, he had smicha from
the Aruch HaShulchan. No? He was the Rav
Novadik. So this gives you an idea. This is an intensely unusual path for a gadol to take. No minyan, no nothing. He is there, the self-made gadol. By the way, spoiler alert, that is the title of the second episode. So we're not going to go too much into that. But what happens, he becomes the Rav, if I'm not mistaken, of Slutsk. Now, Slutsk is a very chashva rabbinate because...
Now, that is a jump. What you just did now is a jump, because you jumped the stage that he got married to a chashva Rav's daughter. That chashva Rav, in turn, was the son-in-law of the Ritbaz, who was the Rav of Slutsk. When the Ritbaz left Slutsk, he gave the Rabbanos over to Rabbi Zalman, who's the Rosh Yeshiva in Slutsk. And when Rabbi Zalman left Slutsk, it went back to the family and went to Rav Yechezkel Abramsky. Rav Yechezkel Abramsky became the Rav of Slutsk, where his wife's grandfather, the Ritbaz, was the original Rav. And that's where he was taken to Siberia under Soviet.
So, as we said before, he defied, in Stalin's time, teaching as a major visible posek and Rav there in Slutsk and in this storied rabbinate. And so we're not going to get that much into the whole parasha of what he did in Soviet Russia, why he escaped. Suffice it just to say that when he was eventually released, he'd become extremely, extremely high profile, internationally well-known Rav, and clearly one of the biggest rising stars in the Gedalia of young Gedalia of them. He had to leave behind his children, I think a couple of his sons, including one who was called Shimon. And
who became a communist. He became a Jewish communist.
Correct. And if I'm not mistaken, he was one of the founders of Britain's Communist Party, so he was a Stalinist supporter, at least a supporter of the regime. And he was, in fact, Dan Abramsky was extremely sad because he was clearly, even in Stalin's time, it was too much for the regime they didn't want the fuss of killing or incarcerating anymore such a famous Jewish figure. So they let him go. They basically expelled him and kept his sons, at least Shimon and perhaps another one of them, as a security of guarantees of good behavior.
The Rav Yechezkel shouldn't be speaking out against
against the regime. And he came, and Shimon, in fact, was, tragically, he used to say during, Dan Abramsky said in those years, he was heartbroken by the thought that his son, who was so, shaky in his Yiddishkeit, was there in this terrible regime, a land of cure. I think it was Rav Moshe Feinstein who compared the Soviet Union to a giant toilet. He said this is a country in which you cannot mention God's name. So I'm not mistaken. He said that's why he said he had to get out of it. It's a country like that you cannot live in. however much Mesiras Nefesh, the kfir in it is so strong.
It must be said that there was an eyewitness, I might be able to remember his name, that he saw the interaction between Rav Yechezkel Abramsky and this son, Shimon, later on in life, when Shimon is coming to visit his father in Eretz Yisrael. And he said, and the kirva between Rav Yechezkel and his son was just warmth. And he was even learning with him, by the way. And it didn't cause a rift between them.
So yes, I in fact saw a report about that. Someone from the I don't recall who now was in came to learn Eretz Yisrael, and after Yechezkel, again jumping the gun, but he eventually comes to move, and he's a Rav from the early 1930s to 1951 in England. Rav being the Abbasin of London, and then he comes to Eretz Yisrael the last quarter of century, where he becomes one of the leaders of From World. In fact, then. And he was a very, very powerful personality. It's important to say, if you've ever seen a picture of Rav Yechezkel Abramsky, you will see pictures don't lie, because you see the sheer power of the personality there. There was, if you just put into the internet, you're going to see, Google search Dayan Abramsky, you will see phrases like the giant or the massive personality. And I know my grandfather, Oliver Shalom, Mr. Max Mechel Guttentag, he said that it wasn't a big man, it was a short man, but a powerful
His presence was, when he walked down the street, you couldn't ignore him. I even sent you a color video, which was rare for those years, of him walking down the streets of Yerushalayim with his lulav and esrog.
In Beit Vaganim must have been where he lived. And anyway, but the point being that, as you pointed out over here, there was a softer side. This Bacha said he said he came in to this to visit Dayan Abramsky, who was a legend to any British Bacha. Learning in Eretz Yisrael, you had to go, and to go and visit Dayan Abramsky, and he was involved in Kol Torah, teaching Kol Torah, gave a share there at that stage. And he came in and he saw that Dayan Abramsky was sitting there over a Gemara with somebody who's sitting there without a yarmulke. That must have been an incredible sight to see the Gedalia sitting there learning with someone without a yarmulke. That was Shimon Abramsky and the son. And this was the way that they as it were, bonded. The Rachmanos that he wanted to keep like ahead of his time. Perhaps this wouldn't be surprising anymore. People are very much, try and keep people within. But the sight of Dayan Abramsky learning with someone that's learning Gemara, some of that yarmulke, that is an unbelievable thing. That was his softer side.
You mentioned before about that his mere appearance was of power, like a lion.
Yeah.
So I read a story somewhere, I don't remember the exact source, that you'll be getting to this later on, is that he once had to appear in court defending his policy that the kashrus of the shechita in England should be under the auspices of his bezdin. And they took him to court. I think that either the sheikhtim, whoever, took him to court, and Dayan Abramsky walked in there, and against protocol, he stood up in front of the judges, which is unheard of in England. The whole decor of you can describe that for the listeners
with their wigs,
right, with the white flowing wigs. And he said, I want you to know that if I give a hashgacha on this meat, I am defying my role as a paisik and a role as serving the public, which is against democracy. And I am not willing to do that. And the judge wrote in the Psak Din, says, we're not accustomed to this, but the old lion roared in our courtroom, and he's right.
Wow. That is, I didn't know the old lion thing. I've seen that used as a title. I didn't know that's where it originated. I think this is going to be a very crucial part of the story here, his character, because it's not enough to have vast Torah knowledge if you don't have A, the Yirah Shamayim, and B, the rock-like and unmoving power and strength of personality to stand up to what's opposing you. You won't achieve anything. And this is what the crucial qualities. Not only was he one of the undisputed Gedalia Yisrael, he also had this tremendous power of personality that enabled him to achieve what he achieved. Now let's get into that and understand the context. We've got a bit of context to understand. Number one, something I've quoted before, which is the context. We know all over the world talk about the 1930s, 40s. If you went across Western Europe and you went in America, the Torah world didn't exist then. It was a few, we talk about, even Orthodoxy was very shva. In England, or was more accurately Britain, together with its empire, you had, like what's happening in America.
Sorry for the Amaratzes.
Yeah.
To explain to us, what's the difference between England and Britain?
Okay, so until this very day, you have, when you talk about, Americans like to talk about British, right? So Great Britain is composed of different countries. Confusingly, there's Great Britain and there's United Kingdom. So let's just talk about the United Kingdom, right? Which is composed essentially of 4 different countries. You have the country of England, which is the dominant part of the country. Most people, most money, most of the landmass. Then you have Scotland, which is enormous to the north. Then you have Wales. And you have, back in the day, 100 years ago, you had Ireland, now only Northern Ireland, because they made a rebellion and they shut it off. But that's the United Kingdom. But at the time, the British Empire was, and this is really important, because when Diana Abramsky was the Basin of London, which is connected to the United Synagogue, is the Basin of the United Synagogue, which is the group of synagogues, of shuls, which are Orthodox, and they're recognized by the government. So the chief rabbi of the United Synagogue has a basin, which is the London Basin, which is essentially recognized as the official representative of the Jewish community until this day. And back in the day, around the time that Diana Abramsky was the Dayan there, this was not a community of less than 250,000 Jews. It was more than 500,000 Jews, plus the countries overseas, part of the British Empire then, Australia, you had South Africa, you had New Zealand, you had other little places as well. Very significant Jewish communities who took their direction.
All these communities were under the direction of...
Correct. So, for example, if anyone who knows, South Africa has a very capable and special chief rabbi today, which is Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein. Well, he was the first South African native, as it was, South African-born chief rabbi in the job. Until then, I remember Chief Rabbi Cyril Harris, who was an Englishman. In fact, I think he was a Scotsman, if I'm not mistaken. I remember him. So he was the chief rabbi of South Africa.
So when you say Britain, you mean the British Empire. When you're talking about England, you're talking about the country within the empire called England.
Correct. But we use it interchangeably. If you grew up, at least in my time, we did not think of ourselves as British. We thought of ourselves as English and thought that the Welsh were also English and the Scots were also English. Confusingly. The point is, Diana Abramsky was appointed in 1931 or 2, if I'm not, to be the chief rabbi of the London Basin, which made him effectively the senior Pesach or the Pesach for the British Empire. Technically, that's what it meant. That's the context in terms of the architecture of the community, of the institutions. There's another crucial piece of context, which is like when you talk about in America, New York, or anywhere else, Yiddishkeit was very, very schwach. In England, you had the United Synagogue, which is unique in that
This is very important what you're saying now, because on the one hand, you're saying that the official structure was Orthodox, but the Kiyum HaMitzvos B'Foyal was very weak.
Correct.
Right. So you're going to have to try to explain that to us. Why isn't that a stira? Because if you would tell me that the Yiddishkeit was schwach when the official structure was, let's say, reform or conservative, I could understand that. But you're telling me that in England, this is the only place that managed to stay under Orthodoxy till today. And at the same time, you're saying that the Yiddishkeit at that time was at a low. So try to explain to this apparent contradiction.
Let me just tell you, just in terms of how low it was, let's start with that and I'll explain how that could be. Just how low it was. So there was one of the first battles that he had to undertake, Diana Abramsky had to fight the fact that in shops or butchers that were selling meat under a London based in Hechsher, they were selling meat without nikur, right? So without doing what's called porging, taking away essentially it was the gidanoshe inside in the high.
People were eating Isudoraisa.
Correct. They were selling it in the same shop, meaning it was kind of like nikur and non-nikur going the same thing.
If you were observant, you'd be able to choose the kosher parts. Correct.
Or it was the Wild West. It was literally the Wild West going on over there. And before he came in, he used the leverage. He found out about it. He said, I cannot take responsibility for this, places. He said that a condition is to shut down these shops. So immediately, even before he got into the job, he began his battle to fight back and raise standards that officially existed, but in the reality didn't. Just one more Mara Mokum, just to understand exactly how difficult things were back in the day. So the Rav Leib Gurvitz, who became Rosh Yeshiva of Gate, said when he arrived in London in the 1920s, he said he saw a fishmonger wrapping fish And then he saw that the fish wrapping, the wrapping paper he'd been writing on it. And he was shocked to see when he went along, he saw it was a terrible sight. It was Chiddushei Torah. This fishmonger, the father was obviously a lamdan, and the father had a son who was a fishmonger who wasn't a lamdan. And what a terrible thing to see. He just was wrapping. You talk about, yesterday's news is tomorrow's fish wrapper or whatever. This was the case. Yesterday's Chiddushei Torah with tomorrow's fish wrapper. So
now you owe us an explanation. Like, how is this possible?
So how's it possible that as you say, you can have an infrastructure that is officially Orthodox, but in reality is all over the place? And in terms of practice, is like in America, Reform, whatever it was. So the answer is, it goes back to, and this is what the story we opened with, that may or may not have happened with Sir Robert Whaley Cohen. Sir Robert Whaley Cohen was, as I say, a government minister. He was involved, I think, in Shell, massively wealthy. And he was part of an extended family that controlled the United Synagogue for many decades. This family came to be known as the Cousinhood. The Cousinhood. I mean, it really has a ring to it. What it was old Jewish patrician families, very noble, very assimilated, kind of the Rothschilds, the Montagues, the Samuels. Now, when we're talking about the Samuels, so anyone who knows, I can see you gesturing. The first British High Commissioner under the British mandate over here was Sir Herbert Samuel. For anyone who is, they have a chain of upmarket hotels here called Herbert Samuel Hotels, right? And he was with the
just as an aside story. Yeah. I don't think it was one of the Gedolim who said that he remembers the women in the Ezos Noshim, in the shuls in Mea Sharim, were crying when they heard that Herbert Samuel was becoming the High Commissioner in Israel. Why is that? It's the first time a Jew is becoming the governor of Eretz Yisrael for over 1,500 years. They thought it was Mashiach Zeiten. So that Gadol learned that from that. He says, don't get excited so easily, right? I remember the old Yiddish mamas crying when Herbert Samuel was, but at the end he was pressured from all sides, and it didn't help the Jews in Eretz Yisrael too much.
Well, actually, if you're talking about detours, and so let me tell you about something that happened the time that I met Sir Herbert Samuel's granddaughter. Listen to this. Did I tell you this one? It was quite a few years ago, arrived in Tzfas and had the bright idea, I think I was newly married, had the bright idea to stay overnight, just to wash up at the place and find somewhere in the old city to stay. Well, it turned out we couldn't find anywhere to stay because it was the Klezmer Festival. The place is chock-a-block. No place to find, nowhere to stay. We eventually, driving around for ages.
That just describes the listeners. That's the week when the streets of the old city of Tzfas are filled with klezmer players.
Correct. It's impossible. It's a 3-day festival, and there was no place to be had. We eventually found somewhere, I think, on Rehov Ha'ari in the old city of Tzfas, and we knocked, and somebody said, knock on this door. We knocked on the door. This people had this, one room to rent. We said, fine. The lady was a Breslover lady, okay, and she welcomed us, as a Breslover couple. She welcomed us, and she said, and I said, I noticed something interesting about the accent. It was both Israeli, but very, very, very English. An Israeli who had traces of extreme English accent. And I said, where do you get that accent? She said, from my mother. I said, where's your mother from? She said, she was brought up on an estate outside Cambridge. I said, what do you mean? She said, and this is a Breslover lady, right, in the intensely Haredi part of Tzfas, she said, my grandfather was Sir Herbert Samuel.
Wow.
No,
that is unbelievable.
That is not that.
You managed to surprise me.
It was an unbelievable thing. I've since tried to track it down. I know where it is. I've been past. She moved away, and I have no idea what she's called. So if she is listening, please, this is your moment. Please come forward. This is an appeal for missing information. So getting back to this, the cousinhood over here. Let me read to you to understand the context of which the lay leadership. The Rabbonim were Orthodox, and the people, many of the members of the United Synagogue, the bulk of Anglo-Jewry, as it was called, was not practicing. Meaning, the shul that they didn't go to most of the time was Orthodox, and remains so today, which is our story.
They needed the Orthodox rabbi for marriage, I guess.
No, but it was more than that. It was more than that, Rabbi Ephraim. They wanted to be Orthodox. Unlike in America, still today, if you ask them, Reform exists in England. but it's not the mainstream, which is the people who may look and practice basically unidentifiable, they're undistinguishable rather from Reform, essentially belong and will get married under an Orthodox based in and Rav. And let me read out to you an essay from the American Commentary magazine that I found sometime October 1964, and it's just, this is just gold. It's worth quoting. The difference, and talking about the difference between England and America, and the fact that America, if you're not Orthodox, you're Reform. In England, you're going to have this strange situation where people are not observant, yet the shul that they don't go to much is Orthodox. And so whoever it was wrote this essay in October 1964 in Commentary magazine. It said like this: the difference can be traced to the role of the old patrician Anglo-Jewish families who founded the United Synagogue in 1870 as a Jewish equivalent to the Church of England. These families, the Rothschilds, the Montagues, the Samuels, etc., were rarely observant Jews, but they gave their names, money, and time, in approximately that order, to the United Synagogue out of a sense of duty. It was the thing to do for any English gentleman who happened to be...
This is fascinating. They had to show the Goyim that we too have a system.
You're so right, because, by the way, until my father, who was a rabbi in the United Synagogue, he wore and still wears, a rabbinic kapot, a frock coat, right? And because up to then it had been the practice in the United Synagogue that they wore what were called canonicals. Canonicals are basically these dark black robes that look very much like the priest at the Church of England. And that because one of the chief rabbis going back a while had decided to make the United Synagogue much more like the Church of England. And I'll tell you another thing. I remember growing up in Manchester, there were the Chashva Talmid Chachamim, who were Rabbonim in all but name. What were they officially called? Reverend. Like the Church of England. Why would there be such a thing? Because in the United Synagogue, it was all aping this Church of England situation. Very sad.
Now, why didn't they? I understand the need to create an institution which is parallel to the church, all right? But l'chatchila, why didn't they create this institution under Reform, conservative? Maybe they weren't there at the time?
I think, remember, this is going back to the 1870s, and let me just finish this quote over here, because I think it could help over here. It said, they gave their time to the United Synagogue out of a sense of duty. It was a thing to do for any English gentleman who happened to be, quote unquote, of the Jewish faith. Being more or less indifferent to religious matters, they had no objection to the nominally Orthodox nature of the United Synagogue. Nominally, because it didn't demand
since
from them
it wasn't mechayev for them.
Correct, didn't demand too much from them, so they could. Paradoxically enough, therefore, the United Synagogue was for decades led by men who neither believed in its doctrines nor practiced its rituals. I mean, what an unbelievable...
No, what's interesting here is that secretly people would respect, if it's not mechayev them, they'll respect Orthodoxy more than the watered-down version of conservative. As long as it's not mechayev, right, it doesn't demand for them much, they're willing to keep that as like the nominal umbrella.
I think you have to understand it does say something about the British character. British character is a non-revolutionary character. Remember,
very
Americans,
conservative,
like conservatives.
With the word conservative, not the
political party, right? It's just to conserve. Correct. It's something about the British character. They don't like revolutions. The last time they had a revolution was they chopped off the head of a king was 500 years ago, and they basically regretted it immediately. So there is something conservative about the British character, and as you correct, it was all very nice and civilized. Orthodoxy was very, very civilized. They could build these enormous cathedrals of shuls, everything carried on that way. I think there is something about the British character in that. But the net effect then was that Abramsky was coming in to a nominally, officially Orthodox environment, but that was very hostile to too much piety, right? That's another thing about the British character.
So here comes the big question. Why did they need Diana Abramsky?
So, good. And
you tell me that they chose Lord Jacobowitz, right, or Rabbi Jonathan Sachs after. I can understand that. I mean, but Diana Abramsky is an old East European style Rav.
So we're going to come back to that, to at least name Lord Jacobowitz in a minute. because he was essentially, it was only thanks to Dan Abramsky's existence and standard setting that he was able to come in over there. In a sense, he was a Talmid. But why did they bring him in? Very important question. And the answer to that goes back to the fact that that the United Synagogue was not the only show in town. From the turn of in the late 19th century, you had waves of Jews coming over from Russia, like they came to Eretz Yisrael, like they flooded into the Lower East Side of New York. They're flooding into the East End of London, which is where the immigrants
And these are more Hamische, Frume Yidden.
Correct. Right. And they found other organizations. Today, if you go to England, you're going to find in London, you're going to find three Batei Din rather, in London. You're going to find the United Synagogues based in London, which has very chashuv rabbanim until this day. You're going to find what's known as the Federation, which has also very chashuv rabbanim. Full disclosure, my older brother is in their ranks. And you're going to find the third thing, which is the Gedalia, which many people know, the Hechsher. That was associated with the Rav Padva, etc. But essentially,
it's more the Hasidim, more.
Yeah, but it's more even. Gedalia is not just the Hasidim; it's also the Echoes of Golders Green, part of Gedalia, right? It was so essentially got these three Batei Din. How did they this? You had the London-based Din, which was affiliated with the United Synagogue, recognized by the government, which is the oldest. What happens? They come along, and the newcomers start feeling that the standards are low, no nikur, no anything.
They're not going to buy meat in a place that sells non-nikur meat.
Correct. Even if at that time that wasn't the case, eventually you see how the Federation developed, and it starts developing as a big network of synagogues, of shuls, and then the Gedalia.
Now the Federation is like a separate unit.
Totally.
But is recognized by the government.
Well, no, the Federation has no necessary standing. It doesn't have a chief rabbi. It has an Av Beis Din. That based in the Federation today is a Chashva Talmid Chacham is Rav Zalman, who was once the Rav of Gateshead, and before that was of Monsey, if I'm not mistaken. Before that was another very Chashva Rav, who was my brother's father-in-law, Dain Lichtenstein, and then you had Gedalia was also very very Chashva Rabbanim, Dain the Padva of great faith.
Is there any official function that like the Federation and the Gedalia would need the United Synagogue to vouch for them,
not in an outright formal sense, because the United Synagogue and its chief rabbi has standing with the governments on issues of wider Orthodox importance. He will go to the government, but it's more informal. That's my sense. He's the biggest stakeholder there in the room, but he's not the only stakeholder, Orthodox stakeholder.
So we're going back. So we're saying. So there was an influx of immigrants,
Eastern European immigrants,
right? And they were taking away the power from the United Synagogue.
Correct. It's like in politics today. If you have a right-wing party which is outflanked on the right by another one that's more right-wing, or a left-wing party that's another one more to the left, it will inevitably draw the larger party into its orbit. Exactly as politics works. So the same way, the Balabatim, who the business people and the men of influence who led the lay people who led the United Synagogue said, we're losing. We need a credible figure who can be listened to in Stamford Hill, right? Which is the area which is a growing population. It wasn't Stamford Hill today, but it was back then. It was the East End of London, which is now a Muslim area. And so they said, who can we get? And they looked around, they saw Dain Abramsky. I think what they identified there was they saw this was a figure of giant stature, but also a figure who was, as it were, who they knew was going to take responsibility for Klal Yisrael.
So he came from Russia, and before he came to the London Bezdin, he was a Rav in a shul, I understand. Before that, I mean, his first stella was a Rav
of a shul in the East End, which was the Machzikei Adas shul. Now, the Machzikei Adas shul was exists today in Golders Green. It's got a wonderful young Rav, and I go there Ben Azmanim if I'm there with my in-laws in London, and around the corner, and it's got a very storied history because 40 years ago it moved from the East End of London, which is right across London, to northwest London, right, East End of London to northwest, and the Rabbonim there who headed the shul. We're talking about 100 years ago. We had two very chashva rabbonim before Dan Abramsky. One of them was Rabbi Avraham Abba Werner, who was, if I'm not mistaken, Slabodka. I don't remember one of the old Litvische Gedalim of.
I know his name because in a short biography written by Rabbi Sroya Divelitsky, who was a very chashva Pesach and Makubal Litvische Makubal in Bnei Brak, he mentions Rav Werner as someone who discovered the Leshem in Europe, and he was
the Leshem, the grandfather of Eliashiv the Mekuba.
First one who wrote like a tiny description, a short description on the Leshem.
Very interesting.
Didn't know that. Right.
And so Reverend was succeeded, when he was left after a few years, he was succeeded as the Rav of Machzikei Hadas by none other than Rav Kook, Rav Yechezkel Cohen Cook, who was stranded then in the First World War.
He already moved from Europe, from East Europe to Yafo.
He was already the Rav of the Yafo, yeah.
Right. And then in World War I, he was stuck in
So there on Machzikei Hadas' headed note paper, there you have, or it said during the war year, the First World War, that is, Rav Kook was the Rav. So he was, then they had a few years in between, many years in fact in between, and the next Rav to come along was Dayan Abramsky. And he comes along, and then the London Basin say he's in town, this is such a great person, we can, for strategic reasons, and he's there installed as the head of the London Basin. Now, it's important to understand the context. Again, there's no visuals here in this podcast, but just to see the photo of the London Basin when he was in office there in his early years, you see the old-style Dayanim with their goatees and their spitzboards and whatever it was, right? English gentleman, Talmid Chachamim, but with the look of an English gentleman. And then Dayan Abramsky with his tall Litvischer yarmulke, his long beard. And you see that was the situation he was coming into. Now, when he left, you see this is the revolution he made, because what he was able to do was install Talmidim, Dayan Rappaport, and Dayan Grosnas, and Dayan Moshe Swift, and Dayan Grunfeld, right, who was the husband of Reb Grunfeld, and that was part of the revolution that he made. So the ambitious retelling of what he was able to achieve it comes down to that context. He was able to come into a context in which the United Synagogue, for all of its orthodoxy, was in danger of slipping into liberalism, for the simple reason that Sir Robert Whaley Cohen and the people like him who led it, and ably abetted by the Jewish Chronicle, which is the oldest Jewish newspaper in the world, which is, as they proudly say, is always leaning left and leaning towards reform. They wanted change, and he stood in the way.
It wasn't easy, I understand.
Yet it was not easy for him to...
As you described before, he laid down demands when before accepting the job.
Yeah, it was not easy to stand up to them. And I think this is where we get to the crux of the argument over here. Again, it's something, there's no particular smoking gun in which you can say, one moment in which you can say, hey, black and white, he saved the empire from going reform. But I think there's a couple of things. I think you start with the most important one, the Louis Jacobs affair. This is the really, really, really important thing where you see the lasting impact that Dayan Abramsky had. Because after the Louis Jacobs affair revolves around the figure of Rabbi Louis Jacobs, who was the deputy Rav of Munk's shul, right, in Golders Green, which is the mainstay of the Yekesha community, Kehila, which came from Berlin, which is Munk's Kehila from Berlin, which is basically one half the mainstay of Golders Green. And he was the deputy Rav there. He was also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, a product of one of the gates of Koilel, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, Louis Jacobs was a very, very brilliant scholar. And he was seen as being on the way to take over as chief rabbi after Rabbi Brody, if I'm not mistaken. And he comes along, Rabbi Brody was a good, Yirei Shamayim, or Rabbi Yisrael Brody. Louis Jacobs, and this eventually, you have to see what eventually became. He split, he was outed as holding beliefs that were not exactly orthodox. And the most important was that Torah is not min hashamayim, right? This was a man who was a heartbeat away from being the head of the chief rabbi. And this is what we're saying. Because of British Jewry's centralized nature, when you're chief rabbi, you control everything. That's it.
There's an impact on thousands.
Impact on the whole of Britain. Everything. Finished. He would have that would have been it. He eventually, when he was outed in an enormous scandal, it's just the Louis Jacobs affair, when his cover was blown, when he came out and said, no, it's not Torah, Torah's not Merash Shamayim, etc., he was forced out. He founded his own movement called the Masorti movement, which still exists in England. Masorti is Masorati. And it was at one time...
You have to differentiate. The Masorati in Eretz Yisrael means that someone believes in Torah and Hashemayim, he doesn't have koach to be mekayim all the mitzvahs.
Right. Well, this is why it's such clever branding, Ephraim. What was this clever branding? Because his pitch to the bulk of British Jewry was that you can have all the benefits of orthodoxy.
He had the culture.
Well, more than that, the benefits. You can be the real thing, but not have the problems. You can do, that's the classic pitch of reform, but it was a latter day reform. It was long after the heyday of kind of the peak. It was reform by stealth, by the back door. And it was very effective. And almost, if I'm not mistaken, my father was telling me that, Manchester, which is, I think in the 80s or the 90s, they were a threat of a major takeover and etc. They could have, this man with his charisma and his erudition and his pitch to British Jewry was that, come, we can ditch the old and you can stay, you'll still have the benefits of it. Imagine that. What was it that stood up to Louis Jacobs? It was the Dayanim of the London Beis Din who he'd left in place, who were Talmidim.
Rav Yechezkel was not there.
Rav Yechezkel was not there, but he was in contact with them. And this would have been his spirit.
He was directing things from Eretz Yisrael.
Yes, I don't know whether it was I'm sure there must be correspondence, but there was never any doubt that these Yerushalayim, these big...
What years are we talking about? Are you talking about the late 1960s?
In the 60s. This was when it was. And so this was, as if you like the smoking gun, which you see, this was how Dayan Abramsky comes along and he ensures it was not the Balabatim. The lay leadership would never have done anything. In fact, they wanted it. This was something they could have embraced because they were so, the Yiddishkeit was so attenuated anyway. It was his spirit hovering over British Jewry and the strength that he gave them, because his Talmidim, remember, these Rabbanim, these Dayanim, he brought them in instead of the old style reverends. He was there having Dayanim who were from Mir, from Baranovich, Gedalia started in their own right.
This is an important nekuda, that aside being a chashav dayan in his own right, you're saying that he managed to cultivate a whole team of people to success him.
Correct. He brought into the heart of the United States Synagogue, instead of just sitting around inside the Haredi communities there of Stanford Hill, etc., and perhaps in Gold's Green, he was able to, because he was in Israel, you're going to call it mamlachti, right? There's a figure, a statesman's-like figure, a figure who truly believed.
They saw an Adam Gadol who was willing to be at the forefront.
Correct, but no, but it goes, I think it goes beyond then. He was an Adam Gadol and he was willing to be at the forefront, but he engaged with the main institutions of Anglo-Jewry. Let's say in a certain way, you're going to find a similar thing with Rabbi Elyashiv as well over here. Rabbi Elyashiv was, some people don't like to remember it, he was a dayan on the Rabbanut. The Rabbanut, like it or not, is a powerful state-sanctioned body. And Rabbi Elyashiv's pitch was, we cannot leave this massively powerful organization to run things without the Torah being there at the top table, having a seat. In the same way, Dan Abramsky said, we can't just leave the London Beis Din with all its power and the vast majority of Anglo-Jewry without the top team there, without the top Torah personalities around. So what he was able to do was, you saw here in the Louis Jacobs affair, that he changed the nature of the Rabbonim, who were then able to stand up.
The ones who blocked him were the members of the Beis Din, not the members of the official rabbinate.
No, but they lead, they lead the rabbinate, right? The Dayanim, and this is one of the anomalies, I think we've talked in previous episodes, the anomalies of British Jewry is that the Choshev Rabbanim are called Dayanim. Right? Anyone who knows that Dayan Duna and Dayan Aaron Troy, they're technically Dayanim, but there's many Choshev, in England, in America, that's certainly not the case. The top Rabbanim are not called Dayanim, and that's because of this thing, because
so everything was institutionalized. Everything came from the structure of the government.
Well, it's not. Everything was institutionalized, and therefore the powerful Rabbonim and the Choshev Rabbonim were the heads of the Batei Din, the various Batei Din. That's historically why it's been the case. But what he also did as part of this thing, he was there created because he was identifiably a Gadol B'Yisrael. He was identifiably a giant Torah figure, identifiably linked to those worlds of first of Eastern Europe and then of Eretz Yisrael, right? And he was in correspondence with Aaron Kotler. He was with the Brisker, etc., as we're going to see in the next episode. But he was able to bring and support from inside the British Jewish establishment, able to support the growing Torah community. So he very much encouraged Bachrim to go off to Eretz Yisrael.
There's talk lately that the Haredi society in Eretz Yisrael, I recently heard Jonathan Rosenblum talking about this at a podcast, that the Haredi society in Eretz Yisrael is growing so much, they can't look at the role as just saving themselves, but like, what do we have to offer to the general public? And you're saying that Rav Yechezkel Abramsky is like the light in front of the nation, showing how you can take this tremendous Masorah and change society, general society in England.
Correct. In other words, he said the Torah has to be there uncompromising and leading from the front of the mainstream institutions that are associated in, let's say, many Haredim's mind and many very from people's mind with kind of the people who are too modern or drifting away. He said, no, they need leadership. We can provide it as well. And in that, I think that's the story in the Chiddush of Rav Yechezkel Abramsky, that he was able as a Gadol B'Yisrael to come and, as it were, to save the empire.
Beautiful.
Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.